Hi, I'm Craig and welcome back to our Making Paradise channel. Today we're doing the apple grafting. This is part 3 of our series on apple grafting. We'll have links to part 1 and part 2, and if you saw part 2, you saw we had a problem getting our apple scionwood out of the ground. I was able to rescue some of it, so we're using that. I have some other varieties that I know what they are, so we've been grafting with those. I've set up just a little easy table just to sit at because I'm doing what's called bench grafting, and it's easier if you have a place to spread your materials out. I have tree coat that I use after I do the grafts just to keep things from drying out. I have some parafilm tape. I also have a PVC tape that was sold for grafting purposes. It's a very thin tape. I like it that it's a ½ inch thick or ½ inch wide, but it's very flimsy and kind of hard to work with. I like the parafilm because it stretches really easy, but this is 3/4 inches wide, and I would be better with a ½ inch wide, which we could not find. I also have labels to put on the trees as I do the grafts. I have a Sharpie to mark on the labels. I have a cheap grafting knife. It's just one blade and a little bit of a pry tool on the other end of it. That's not necessary for what I'm doing today with the pry tool. You basically just need a sharp blade. You can use a razor blade. You can get a knife like this. I also have my pruners because I'm getting the rootstock and cutting them down to size. Now, on the subject of rootstock, I got the rootstock in today. This is the apple rootstock. I took it out of the box. I put it in the water to soak while I'm working with it. It can stay in the water for about 24 hours. After that, it'll start drowning. So what I don't use today, I'll trench into the ground so we can use it, not let it drown, but use it later. It's about 2 feet long. Some of them have very few roots, and there are some that have very extensive roots on them. Because I'm not going to use all these today, I'm trying to find the ones with the really good roots, give my trees a good start. The rootstocks will range from just a little bit smaller than a pencil to slightly larger than a pencil. That's about the largest diameter there. These rootstocks are about 2 feet long, and some people will go ahead and do the graft on the very end of it. So they'll have 2 feet of the trunk of that rootstock variety, and then the graft will start there. My personal preference is I just prefer to cut these about in half. What I found is if I put the top half in a rooting chamber, get about 50 to 80% rooting with these, a little bit of hormone on them so I can use those next year. I have a piece of scionwood here. This was all 1 year's growth. This was obviously a what's called a water shoot that comes up near the center trunk of the tree. They're very fast growing, very vigorous. So this would have actually been about 3 feet long before I cut it back to this. This is about the same diameter as the rootstock. So for that, we'll do what's called whip and cleft grafting. So with scionwood that's about the same diameter as the rootstock, basically I just cut off the end of it to make sure I have fresh wood. Then I take the grafting knife and cut it at an angle like so. Then take the grafting knife and insert about not quite halfway into the depth of the wood to cut down into the wood itself. So you're actually splitting it just a little bit. Then you set that down. You make sure you don't get dirt or anything in it. So you set that down with the cut side up. Take your rootstock, and try to cut about the same angle straight in the rootstock. Here I have the rootstock and the scionwood, and you can tell that's about the same angle. Then I take the grafting knife and cut into the rootstock the same way that I did on the scionwood, cutting vertically into it. Now, if you notice, you can actually push this little flap of wood back a little bit, and you can do the same on the scionwood. So there's a gap there. And then you just simply put them together by pushing those two so that they interlock. You want to line up basically the bark and everything on at least one side of your rootstock and your scionwood. So if your rootstock's a little bit bigger diameter, you can still do this kind of cut, but the scionwood will be off to one side. One side, as long as it's flush on one side, it should take pretty good. So you push that together. Sometimes when you cut like this, you'll end up with a little piece that sticks out like that beyond the stick, the scionwood. And I'll actually just cut that off a little bit to make it easier to wrap it with the tape. But wedge it together. And the other thing is, I don't need this entire length of scionwood. I only need about 2 buds above that cut. So if I go ahead and cut it off with 2 buds, it's a little bit easier to work with, easier to handle. So jam them together, and then I take one of these tapes and start wrapping, pulling it as tight as I can without the tape breaking. Wrap it up past the joint. And this time I started about 1/2 inch below the joint and went maybe 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch above the joint. And then that's pretty secure just with the tape. One thing I do just as an extra precaution, because I want to keep all the moisture in here and everything to make this heal back on itself, I take this tree coat, which is a very messy compound. You get it on your hands, it won't come off for a couple of days. And I cannot work with gloves. So if you can wear gloves while you do this, try to. But I just cover everything, all of that tape. With this tree coat, I cover the cut end. Just keeps any moisture in there from drying out. I'll set that on the bench for a minute, and then I'll label. And that basically is your typical whipping graft. We'll put this in a pot, water it good, move it out where the deer can't get to it, and that one will grow on and it should form a callus here and should grow. The other thing with this rootstock is that there's obviously a lot of roots at the bottom of it, and then there were places where the roots came out higher up on the tree. You can plant it in a pot just with that bottom root section in it, or you can try to get as much of those upper roots in as your pot is deep. My pots aren't that deep, so that upper root's just going to be out of the dirt. It'll be fine with no problem. A lot of times you run into a problem if you're getting your scionwood from older trees, because the trees are just not growing vigorously on the ends where you can still get material that'll root. For instance, this piece of scionwood here is a much smaller diameter than any of the smallest rootstock I have. What I found works fairly well with something like this is cut the rootstock straight off, 90 degrees. Take the grafting knife and just cut Really don't want to be touching the... I have a piece of parafilm basically to keep the graft from getting dirt on it. Any contaminants could get in the graft and cause your graft to fail. So I've cut that as close to a wedge as I can. And then I'm taking the rootstock and cutting straight down into the middle of it. And you can see I actually go quite a ways down into the rootstock, about an inch or so. And the rootstock then holds apart like that, and you can insert that cut edge of the scionwood down into it. And again, you want to have it flush with one side of the rootstock. On this side is put in where it's flush. On the other side, the scionwood is, an eighth of an inch recessed in from the edge over here. I'm going to wrap that good with the tape to hold it in place. And while it doesn't look like it should work, what will happen is that the juices and nutrients coming up from the rootstock will line up in that under layer of the bark there and continue to supply into the scionwood here, and that will callus over and it will form a successful graft most of the time. These don't always work, but as I said, with an old variety, it's my best option to try to do anything. And here I've got 4 buds above the graft. I'm going to cut it off just above the second graft or second bud. If I was really desperate for scionwood, I could even come with this little tiny piece, do it the same thing, do it on another rootstock. But I've got enough of this variety. I don't need to be that stingy. Then I'm going to coat it again with the tree coat. Label it and let it grow out too. So I have these couple of grafts that I just put together. I'm setting them in a bucket of water right now till I get a dozen to 20, and then I'll pot those up, get them moved out where they go. We ended up grafting 121 apples and 8 pears. Moved them out here into our deer barrier because we know that deer love these. They're like candy to deer. So we're going to protect these, keep them watered. And probably about 2 months before we know how many of these grafts are successful, they'll start budding out on the graft scionwood. The rootstocks will also be budding out. We also have about 40 rootstocks that I have potted up that I'll use for grafting later on this summer during T-bud grafting. One thing we've done, we learned last year, is these little plastic tags we put to identify our tree varieties. You get a good gust of wind because there's not branches up top, these will blow off sometimes. So what we've also learned to do is to take a paint marker and write the variety name and the rootstock name on the pot itself, so if that tag does come off, we can re-identify what our varieties are. This is kind of a stopping point with our apple and pear grafting project. A couple of months, we'll know whether these are successful. Check back with us then, see how our progress went.